Hi, Marie here from Pottery Crafters. In this video, I'll go through 21 important clay tips that will greatly improve the odds of your clay creation turning out. All the supplies used and the videos mentioned are listed for you below in the show notes. The first tip, and one of the most important, is knowing the firing temperature of your clay bodies. Not all pottery fires at the same temperature. Clay bodies are formulated to fire to 1,828 degrees Fahrenheit or 998 degrees Celsius, all the way to 2,345 degrees Fahrenheit or 1,285 degrees Celsius, which is also called cones. Clays are identified mainly by their cone size, with cone 06 to 04 being the low fire clays, cone 5-6 are the mid-fire clays, and cone 10 clays are the high-fire clays. Now you can low-fire a mid-fire or high-fire clay, which I actually use for raku firing. They will be more porous and weaker, which is fine. The only thing you have to be aware of is if they're compatible with the low-fire glazes. The main thing to be aware of is overfiring a low fire or even a mid-fire clay. If this happens, the clay will melt. For the best results, clays and glazes should match the firing temperature because you want them to contract and expand together in the kiln. If they don't marry well in the kiln, you can get crazing or even cracking. Always check your clay bag or product label for the recommended cone range, and use pyrometric cones for your kiln to ensure accuracy. If you don't know your firing range and you want to fire past cone 04, it's best to test a little piece of clay out and put it on a cookie and see if it melts. Wedging your clay thoroughly. I know this is something most of us don't want to do, unless we have a pug mill. Whether you're throwing or hand building, it's always best to wedge your clay. Now, the importance of wedging your clay can really have an effect on how your piece turns out. Wedging removes air bubbles and aligns the clay particles, which helps prevent cracks and even blowouts in the kiln. Wedging also gives a uniform moisture content, improving plasticity and making the clay more workable. Don't skip wedging even if it's a pre-mixed bag of clay. A few minutes of wedging is much better than the frustration of trying to fix any cracks later. Personally, I don't like wedging clay either, but I'll think of it in the most positive way. As I'm wedging, I think I'm going to get some good exercise. Now that's a positive way to think about it. There are different ways that you can wedge your clay. Spiral wedge, ram's head wedge, even the stack and slam works really well. If you're having any problems with wedging or you don't really know which technique is best for you, I have a post with a video on my Pottery Crafters website. I left the link for you below in the show notes. Compressing your clay. Compressing your clay plays a very important role when crafting your pottery, and it should never be overlooked. It aligns the clay particles, allowing the clay to dry more evenly and reduces the chance of cracking and even warping when fired in the kiln. You may get away with it, but I haven't. If the clay particles are not aligned, they push against each other, causing the pottery to crack. When the clay particles are aligned, they flow smoothly into place when drying, thus avoiding the cracks. When you pull up the walls when throwing on the wheel, you're automatically compressing the sides. Therefore, you must compress the bottom and the rim of the pot every time. You can use your fingers to compress the rim. You can use a sponge or your fingers to compress the bottom by applying firm and even pressure across the base. When hand building, compress both sides of the slab with a rib to align the clay particles. Along with wedging and knowing the clay's firing temperature, compressing your clay is also one of the most important steps that you don't want to skip, because you don't want cracked or warped pottery. Using a wire cutter for slicing your clay. Of course, I have several different ones laying around the studio for convenience. And I have this wire cutter that comes in really handy. I made it myself, but sometimes it can be a bit noisy, but it works great. I just love it. Have you ever seen a potter dig into clay with their bare hands? I have, and I found it very difficult to separate the clay. Plus, the likelihood of getting an air pocket just went way up. A wire cutter is essential for slicing through the clay clearly to inspect the inside of your clay, or for the stack and slam. That is a fun way to wedge. They're also used for removing pots off the wheel or bat after throwing. Wire cutters will give you a nice clean cut every time. You just can't play with clay without using a wire cutter. Choosing the right clay for your project. For hand building, you'll want a clay with more texture or strength to it. Clays with grog or sand do tend to be better for hand building and keep your piece up and more stable. Now, I've used clay without grog or sand for hand building, but you have to be careful of the moisture content and slumping, and know that the clay without grog is going to have a higher shrinkage rate. When you're throwing on the wheel, you want the clay to be as smooth as possible, but also have the ability to stay up as long as possible, especially when you're throwing large pots. Now, the smooth clay is easy on your hands, but not as stable. So you want a clay that's going to be a little more stable and hold up a little longer when you're throwing. Clay with fine grog or even sand would be recommended also. For a full breakdown on how to choose the right clay for your needs, check out my video on choosing the right clay. I left the link for you below in the show notes. Labeling your clay. Now, this tip is very important because I've done it from time to time and regretted it every single time, where you think you'll remember the clay, but you don't. If you use different clay bodies for different projects and the colors are very similar, you need to label your clay. Keeping track of which clay is which is important. Now, I fire mid-fire and I don't have low-fire clay, but I still want to know what clay body I'm using. Now, if you have low-fire clay bodies and high-fire clay bodies, it's extremely important to label your clay. You don't want to mess up on that. I use this posted tape so it's not that sticky and it'll come off easily if I change clay bodies and save the bag. Or you can just put it onto the bag if you want, but just make sure you label your clay. Now, this is an important tip, but aren't they all? Don't mix your clay bodies without testing them first. Back in the day, I was told never to mix clay bodies because they turn into a different clay body. And you don't want to take chances with using different clay bodies when you're first starting out, which makes sense. Even if it's the same firing temperature, different clay bodies have different shrinkage rates because they have different ingredients. That's why we have so many different clay bodies. And when you mix them together, you get different reactions. With that said, it's best to always test your mixed clay bodies before committing to a large project. Knowing the 7 stages of clay. It's important to know each stage of clay because there are different things you can do at different stages of clay. You need to know when to mold the clay, when to carve the clay, when to trim the clay, when to add underglaze or slip to the clay. If you like what you see, give this video a thumbs up. Hit subscribe if you haven't already, and hit the bell icon to get notified when a new video comes out. When to bisque the clay, when to glaze the clay, and when to fire the clay. And knowing each one and what to do at each stage is very important. I have a video on all 7 stages of clay. I left the link for you below in the show notes. Use bats and wereboards to move your clay pieces around the studio. Use bats when removing soft pots from the wheel. This helps to avoid any mishaps or damaging your piece if it's too wet when you're trying to get it off the wheel. You can take your piece off the wheel right away and start working on another piece while the other piece has dried enough so you won't get any fingerprints on it or damage it in any way while you're taking it off of the bat. It makes throwing on the wheel go a lot smoother and a bit faster. The same with wereboards. They're great for working on, putting plastic over them to keep the clay moist. Wereboards are very convenient for moving your pottery around the studio. There are times in the clay stages where the clay is very fragile and can be deformed very easily. So wereboards and bats are really good to use in the studio. Scoring and slipping for stronger bonds. When joining clay pieces together, either from hand building or attaching handles from wheel throwing, it's best to always score and slip the surfaces. Now I know some potters just don't do it, but I'm not one of them. I am not going to take the chance on all of the work that I put into crafting this piece of pottery just to have it crack on me because I didn't take the time to score and slip the attachments. And it really pays off for me because I rarely have any attachments crack on me. With that said, it's always best to take that extra time to score and slip when attaching clay together. Having the right surface for your clay. The best surface for your clay needs to have some grip to prevent the clay from sliding off or from the clay sticking to the surface. The surface also needs to be somewhat absorbent, but not too much. Otherwise, it'll dry out your clay too fast. A few surfaces that work the best are unpolished natural stones such as marble, granite, slate, and even quartz. They provide a non-stick and absorbent surface. They're durable and easy to clean, though some stones like granite may stain. Make sure the stone is unpolished to maintain the necessary grip. Concrete surfaces also work great. They're durable and provide a stable, non-stick workplace. Untreated wood is a great surface to work on, like birch, maple, oak, or even a high-grade plywood. Wood is my favorite to work on. It's easy to clean, and you can sand it if it becomes rough. My piece of wood is connected to my work table with C-clamps. The C-clamps keep the wood in place and flat. When it wears out, I just get another piece of wood, usually birch or oak. You can also check out the post on my Pottery Crafters website with 7 different surfaces for you to choose from. I left the link for you below in the show notes. Keep your clay moist. Make sure your clay has the proper amount of moisture in it when working on it and maintains that moisture during a break. If you're hand building, you don't want your clay to be so soft that it won't stand up on its own, or too dry that when you bend it, it'll crack. The same goes with throwing on the wheel. If the clay isn't moist enough, it'll be very hard to center and throw. If it's too soft, your clay will collapse when you're trying to form a bowl or a cylinder. If you're working on a piece of clay and you run out of time for the day, that's okay. There are several ways that you can keep your clay moist until you continue to work on it. A damp box works great. It protects your project from you or anyone else bumping into it. Wrapping your clay up in a light, damp cloth also works well. Then cover it with plastic. I found cheesecloth and saran wrap works really well. When hand building, keeping your clay covered with plastic wrap or even spritzing your clay a little bit to keep it nice and moist, but not too moist. And when throwing on the wheel, introducing a little water from time to time keeps the clay nice and moist and easy to throw. It's important to keep your clay not too wet and not too dry. You need that balance right in the middle. What to do with your clay water? Well, certainly don't pour it down the drain. As you know, clay is very sticky, and over time it will clog your pipes. But keep in mind, over time. So when you start throwing it down the drain, thinking everything's fine, it's not. It's slowly sticking to your pipes. The good news is you can use these methods instead. You can use a sink trap to capture the clay, which is a good alternative and used in most studios. Pour the clay water back into the earth if you have the proper area to do that in. Once the clay is settled, the water can be poured off and the remaining clay sludge can be turned into slip. You can dry out your clay and dispose of it, or you can recycle it. I turn my clay water into slip. I dry it out and recycle it. I also dry out the dirty clay water and throw it away. Another good tip is recycling your clay scraps. Recycling your clay scraps is a smart move and saves money. Clay isn't cheap, especially if you go through a lot of it. Recycling your clay scraps lets you reuse material instead of constantly buying new clay. Through the process of crafting clay, a lot of clay can be trimmed or just left unused. Instead of tossing it, recycling keeps it out of the landfills and puts it back in your hands. I found the best way to recycle is to dry your clay out first. This way it doesn't sit in a bucket too long and get moldy, and it's a lot less messy. Plus, water doesn't penetrate into damp or wet clay as well. By allowing the clay to dry out thoroughly first, the water will absorb more evenly and faster throughout the clay. I recycle my clay using the pillowcase method. I found it to be the less messiest way and the fastest way to rehydrate my clay. If you want to know more about a faster, less messy way to recycle your clay, I left the video for you below in the show notes. Storing your clay. To preserve the moisture in your clay and prevent mold from growing, your leftover clay should be sealed in buckets or heavy plastic bags. Getting all the air out and sealing it in the bag is the best way to keep mold away from moist clay, because mold needs oxygen to survive and thrive. After I seal my moist clay tightly, I place it in a plastic container also. If you store your clay for a long time, it's best to check on it from time to time because the clay can start to dry out. If so, you can poke holes in the clay and pour some water in. Seal it back up and place it back into the container. Then when you're ready to use it, just wedge out your clay and you're ready to play. Test your clay body before buying bulk. Before committing to a large purchase, it's smart to try out small amounts of different clay bodies so you don't waste any money on clay. Whether you're hand building or wheel throwing, you need to know how each clay feels and responds to your techniques. It's also good to know the clay's capability, how it works with your glazes, and your firing ranges. Some studios will give out samples. Some friends will also give out samples. I have a friend that tries different clays, and she gives me small amounts to see how I like them and how they go with my glazes. That works out great. So once you find the clay that works best for you and your glazes, then you can buy bulk. Keeping the clay dust down in your work area. Even though clay is non-toxic and safe to play with when wet, you still need to be aware that dry clay particles can get in the air and they're not good for your lungs over time and may cause health problems. Knowing you can't eliminate all clay dust completely, minimizing the amount of dust is the best way to play with clay. When it comes to dry clay in the studio, this damp sponge is my best friend. I always keep a bucket of water with the sponge in it. This is one of the most common sizes of sponges, and I always cut them in half. They're much more easy to use and easier to wring out, especially if your hands are smaller. Keep a spray bottle filled with water handy. I use this mister spray bottle and lightly mist my work surface. Works great, especially on canvas-covered boards. When you're finished working, wipe the clay down with a damp sponge or even a rag is fine. It's best to sand your pottery outside, but if outside is impossible, wearing a protective mask and using a wet sponge or even wet sanding paper instead is a better alternative. For more detailed information to keeping the dust down, you can refer to my full article. I left the link for you below in the show notes. Avoid sharp edges and try and maintain the same thickness throughout your piece. Now, of course, you will have attachments and you will have points where it's a bit thicker and thinner. But the same thickness really does make a difference when you're drying the clay and firing the clay. So keep that in mind when creating your unique piece of pottery. Clay loves to be smooth. Any sharp edges that dry and fire can be so sharp that they'll cut you. So if you're hand building or wheel throwing, make sure all of your edges are smoothed over. Dry your clay slowly and evenly. It's actually more important to dry your clay evenly, but you still don't want to rush the process. Drying your clay too fast can lead to cracks and warping, especially if your clay is thicker or has uneven areas. Drying unevenly actually puts tension on the particles that are dry as opposed to the ones that are wet. And when you see clay in nature, you can see the big cracks because that's what clay does. So to keep clay from doing what it naturally does, it's best to dry it evenly. And that would be done by covering it because you don't want the top to dry out faster than the bottom. That's when the cracks form. Now, of course, they don't always form, but the likelihood of the cracks forming by uneven drying goes way up if you don't cover it first. I'll cover my pieces in plastic, and in the morning I'll uncover it and flip the pieces over carefully, place the plastic back on, and then in the evening I'll do the same thing. Cover it back up. The next day do the same thing, and then uncover it completely and let it dry on its own for the next week. Doing it this way, I have no cracks. It works really well for me, and it should work just as good for you. Watch for mold growth in your clay. Wet clay that sits in the open in a bucket of water for a long time is the perfect breeding ground for mold to take over. Now, mold is naturally present in all clays, some clays more than others, and for the most part is harmless. But if you're allergic or around too much mold, the mold can have an adverse effect on your health over time. The good news is the mold can be neutralized with several products. I was told you could use bleach, vinegar, or even hydrogen peroxide, so I put them to test. If you want to know which one or ones work the best, you can check out my video where I tried out the 3 different products and showed which ones reduced the amount of mold and which ones almost eliminated all of the mold. I left the link for you below in the show notes. Keep a clay journal. It's helpful to track the clay bodies you've used, the results from your firing, the mixing experiments, and the shrinkage rate. It's good to know what issues you've had with different clay bodies and which ones were successful, which ones had bigger shrinkage rates than others, how well they worked, which one your favorite is. Keeping track of the measurements of the pieces that you've thrown or hand-built, especially if you want to recreate that same piece. Journals are very important and very helpful for, how did I do that? The more of these tips that you incorporate into crafting your clay, the greater the odds that the pottery that you've created will turn out the way you planned. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and hit the bell icon to get notified whenever a new video comes out. You watching helps me to create more videos like this one. Now head on over to my How to Make Wereboards video or How to Choose Your Pottery Clay video. If you do, I get to play with more clay. Let's stay dirty.